webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tamara Bingham Noyes. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Center for Change. We're so happy that you could join us for our webinar in our series. We're excited to have EJ Hackett with us today. Before we launch into the webinar, I want to just go over a couple of things that you'll see on your screen, some reminders. First, a copy of the PowerPoint is in the handout section of the toolbar. So if you'll click on the handout section, you'll see a copy of the PowerPoint there. You're more than welcome to download that or print that if that's something that you'd like to do. A copy of the post test is in the handout section of the toolbar as well. Please keep in mind that this is for reference only. You're welcome to look at it and refer to it throughout EJ's presentation, but in order to obtain continuing education credit, you must take the online post test. You're welcome to submit questions in the questions section of the toolbar. We'll try to get to a few of those at the end of the webinar. So feel free to write those questions. I'll keep an eye on them throughout the presentation. And then at the end, I'll give a couple of those questions to EJ for her to answer at the end. When the webinar ends, please fill out the evaluation that pops up. It will automatically pop up when I close the webinar. That's an evaluation that gives us feedback about the webinar itself. It's a continuing education requirement for us. It's completely anonymous. We then gather that data from those evaluations and send it to our continuing education providers. So if you would take just 30 seconds to fill out that evaluation at the end of the webinar, that would be great. And then about an hour after the webinar ends, you'll receive a separate email from GoToWebinar with the link to take the online post test. You must take the post test online in order to receive continuing education credit. Once you pass the test, your certificate of attendance and completion will automatically be downloaded to your computer. So look for that. If you don't see it, check your downloads file because sometimes it hides there. So with that being said, I'll review those again at the end of the webinar for those of you who are just joining us. So no worries, I promise to go over it again. But in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and turn the time over to EJ. EJ's a great therapist in our local community. She had graciously, there we go, agreed to do a presentation for us at our Cottonwood Heights, Salt Lake City location for local clinicians. And then we had a global pandemic and we had to cancel that. And so she then was kind enough to agree to do it in a webinar instead, which is lucky for us. So if we can take a good thing out of a global pandemic, this is one of them, that we get to have EJ for many more people than would be able to attend at our Cottonwood Heights location. So I'm thrilled to have EJ with us. I'm going to go ahead and switch things over to her. So EJ, I'm going to hand you the screen.
Okay. Did it work?
Yep, I can see it, and then you just need to start your slideshow from the beginning. It's working on it, I think. There we go. It's trying. There we go.
All right.
Okay, you're up and running. I'll let you introduce yourself and then just launch right in, and I will turn off my mic and my video, and I'll just let you take it from here.
Okay, sounds great. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to go a little bit quickly to try to make sure that we get through everything. Of course, this presentation is focused on how we would approach stage 1 trauma with therapists, but for those of you that are joining us from different disciplines, I'm happy to entertain any questions at the end, or you're welcome to email me at the end if there's anything that you wanted to know that we didn't have time for today. All right, so a little bit about me. I started my career in eating disorder therapy research as a research assistant for Dr. Michael Lowe at Drexel University in Philadelphia. While I was there, I got to participate in a variety of different studies related to restraint scale. We did an interesting study on the psychological impacts of the freshman 15. on freshman women coming in. And we also collaborated on many projects with the Renfrew Center of Philadelphia, which is, I believe, the oldest residential eating disorder facility in the United States. After that, and when I was in practice, I was a primary eating disorder therapist at Ridgeview Institute in Atlanta, Georgia. That was a inpatient partial hospitalization IOP program. Also had some like residential options, at least the recovery residents there. And everyone that admitted into that program had to have either a primary diagnosis of an eating disorder or trauma history. And then after that, I stepped into a clinical role as well as leadership role at Atlanta Center for Eating Disorders. And that was a facility that offered partial hospitalization, intensive outpatient and outpatient programming, and then residential treatment towards the end of my time there. Over the last year and a half, I decided I wanted to be closer to family. And so I moved back to Utah, and I've been doing outpatient therapy since, again, with folks that have a primary diagnosis of either an eating disorder or trauma history. And there, just because she's adorable, is a picture of my little one there. All right, I don't have any disclosures to discuss. And what we're going to be talking about today is how do we manage eating disorder symptoms and PTSD-related symptoms in the stabilization process. All right, we're going to talk about various different therapeutic tools for cultivating safety and containment, as well as exploring how do you talk about trauma with an emphasis on the present moment as opposed to memories. Right. So let's delve into the research a little bit. I'm sure it doesn't surprise anybody here that's working in this field to see these numbers. This is a study from 2013 that looked at the links between eating disorders and traumatic events. The only thing that may be surprising about this graph is actually how low the percentages are, at least was for me, and of course this is just one study. But certainly in my experience, there are much more folks than not with some sort of interpersonal related trauma history. Right? A study from 2012 indicated a significant link between interpersonal trauma and eating disorder symptoms, with higher rates of PTSD in those with bulimia and binge eating disorder. Again, not surprising if you're working in the field. Binge eating disorder and bulimia seem to be more associated with childhood abuse, which of course supports the idea of monitoring for eating disorder symptoms in survivors as a preventative measure that we can be taking. And a 2013 study suggested that attachment insecurity may be a link between childhood maltreatment and later eating disorder symptoms. Right? Again, not surprising to us, it's that disruption of connection with others in those interpersonal related traumas that make it difficult for folks to utilize the benefit of connection with others in managing their emotional experience in life. Right. So again, not surprising for us to know that this is the case, but given that, how do we then attend to both someone's interpersonal trauma history and their eating disorder pathology? And unfortunately, there's not enough out there in the literature on what does this look like and what is supported. Again, it probably doesn't surprise many of you. While a 2017 review indicated that while the EMDR seems to be a promising approach, we need more research, and we need more research to show its efficacy in the stabilization process, specifically with folks that also are struggling with an eating disorder. But certainly, the most promising option that we have out there thus far, other than, of course, the longstanding support that there is for use of DBT, both with PTSD-related symptoms and eating disorder-related symptoms, but I was not able to find anything that specifically spoke to PTSD and eating disorder symptoms as comorbid with each other. And I wasn't able to find any research, despite looking for quite some time, on research related to cognitive processing therapy and somatic experience specific with eating disorders. Of course, if any of you have any resources, please send them my way, because I'd be happy to look over those, and of course want to make sure that I'm presenting the most up-to-date data out there. Okay, so given this lack of research evidence, my preference is, of course, to err on the side of caution. right? We have to make sure that we're working with folks carefully when they're in that very vulnerable state of the beginning processes of therapy. And what the literature supports right now is that focus on behavior change, initial education, skill building, as well as that providing a framework for how do you talk about the current impacts of trauma history, right? We need to, as those of you that work with trauma already know, slow and steady wins the race, right? If we don't have that foundation of safety, folks don't feel like they have the ability to contain their emotions when they need to, then that just leads to dysregulation and of course an amping up of eating disorder related behaviors to try to cope, right? So we want to be really mindful in the time of that. So the 3-stage model of trauma therapy that I was introduced to in graduate school and continues to resonate for me is this 3-stage process, right? With the first stage being that safety and containment model where we're educating, we're working on skills to quiet the amygdala, decrease that emotional reactivity so that someone may actually be able to process and grow and learn, right? And of course, symptom management with PTSD related symptoms and eating disorder related symptoms. If someone is engaging in binging and purging behaviors every day, their emotional experience is numbed, right? So that limits their capacity for processing and learning in a therapy setting, right? So have to have that safety and containment before we can delve into the cognitive and emotional processing, which is stage 2. And this is the piece that we hear probably the most about in trauma-oriented therapy, but the foundation is laid in that stage 1. Now, stage 3 work kind of actually intermingles a little bit. I'll absolutely talk about it in stage 1, but we get to really delving into it after we've done some significant processing work. And this is where we're reclaiming our life and meaning, right? It's in reconciling the world's ugly truths. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm encouraging folks to walk around with rose-tinted glasses. It's the idea of acknowledging that while bad things happen to good people and that life is not fair, I can choose to thrive anyway, right? And that's kind of the ending piece of trauma resolution and therapy. Okay, so in that beginning with education, I want to first talk with folks about how do they talk about trauma safely, right? A lot of our folks have not felt heard and they desperately want to tell their story because they feel like if I just get it out, then I'll feel better, right? But there's definitely a difference, pardon the pun or expression, word vomit versus actually processing, right? So especially in a group therapy setting, I will emphasize, there's a big difference between I was molested by my uncle between the ages of 8 and 12, and it continues to affect me in the following ways, right? Versus I can remember laying in bed at night, my body tense, waiting and listening for the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. The second example is much more emotionally activating, can bring someone speaking about it back to a memory or a flashback, which feels supremely emotionally unsafe. And if it's in a group setting, can dysregulate the whole group. And we can't really be productive in that when we're in that state. So we want to help folks of like, okay, yes, we can talk about this, but we need to be intentional and honor your safety and having really firm boundaries around that. We want to focus it on how does their history impact the way they currently think about themselves, others, the world, as well as how it impacts their behavior. Next, I'll introduce this idea of window of tolerance. So those of you that are joining me from Atlanta, you'll probably are very familiar with this model from Kathy Steele. She's of course well known and well respected in the area, and I resonated very much so with her model with this. And it's something that likely we've been exposed to, but maybe the different verbiage is helpful in presenting it to our clients. And so the window of tolerance is the range of experiential intensity that someone can tolerate. And the silly example that I use with this is thinking about test anxiety, because that's usually something that everybody can relate to. That actually some test anxiety is helpful, right? If we don't care at all, if we're not anxious at all, we're likely to make silly mistakes, right? Because we weren't paying enough attention. Versus if we're so overwhelmed and so anxious about that test, then we're going to make mistakes for another reason, right? Because we're trying to manage emotions, or we're second guessing ourselves, right? But a little bit, there's that sweet spot of we want therapy to be uncomfortable, but not dysregulating, right? And then, so in explaining this idea or this construct with clients, I want to emphasize that we have to first understand where their individual window is and honor where that individual window is before we can even begin to transition to the goal of widening that window and increasing their tolerance for a heightened emotional experience. This is just a visual to help demonstrate how, or, what the window of tolerance might look like if we were to graph it out. So we want our clients as much as possible to be living in this middle area, learning where their upper limit is as well as their lower limit, but much more emphasized on the upper limit, because even for our folks that seem disengaged, numb, or prone to dissociation, it's prompted by hyperarousal. Right? So that the activation of that fight or flight response, and even if it's real quick, then they plummet down into that numbness, or like I said, disassociation, it's preceded by someone stepping outside of the upper limits of their window, right? So while this may make sense in how this applies, naturally for trauma folks, it's important to, I feel, kind of emphasize with my clients how this applies specifically to their eating disorder, right? So I talk a lot about the function of behavior. What is the purpose that we're trying to make? Because we want to honor that it's coming from someplace good, right? So I view the eating disorder as an attempt to get back into one's window. But just like any avoidance-based coping strategy, it doesn't work for long. And we have to kind of keep ramping it up to get the same effect, right? And the window of tolerance for someone gets smaller and smaller the more that they use and engage those behaviors, so they have less ability to tolerate the emotions of everyday life, right? So talking about this with my clients can be extremely validating for them in feeling heard that, okay, you get it of why I want to hold on to these behaviors. It feels absolutely intolerable to think about not restricting, binging, purging. Right? And it also behooves us to make sure that we have a good argument for why we're asking them to replace these behaviors. That's where we can, in having a model to talk about this, something that they're already experiencing internally, can help with cultivating hope for, all right, this is what's happening, and all right, that gives me a roadway towards how do we widen that window and change my life and emotional experience. So when someone is in the hyper-aroused state, we want to help them with kind of de-escalating and getting back into their window. And these are definitely, and we'll talk later about DBT-oriented skills that we would utilize in this, but generally, this is where we talk about, and I'll talk about ahead of time so they know what to expect. A little bit, but we'll talk about the difference between this distraction and avoidance, right? Distraction is in the moment, that distress tolerance, how do I get through this moment, versus avoidance is I'm never going to attend to this, I'm just always pushing it to the side, which leads to introducing the construct of containment. If you're constantly avoiding, then that means that those thoughts, those feelings are going to pop up at inopportune moments. The analogy I use is if we have a beach ball on, in a pool and we're pressing it down, if something happens to kind of slip it out of our grasp, it's going to pop way up into the air, right? So that pushing the ball down underwater is an example of avoidance, versus maybe we're kind of holding it on the surface of the water, letting it bob up and down with the waves, and if we let go, it's not going to fly up into the air, right? So empowering our clients to learn how do we contain these emotional experiences. I'm going to get into more uncomfortable content in a therapy session, but I'm going to be focusing on distraction and self-soothing outside of here, so that I feel like this isn't taking over my life. Of course, we want to help them in building skills around reassuring and soothing themselves. This is where we'll utilize a lot of grounding techniques, right, of engaging the 5 senses. In an eating disorder facility, probably more so 4 senses. What can you see? What can you feel? What does the texture of your shirt feel like? And how does that differ from the texture of the chair you're sitting on? Certainly if they're in a moment of a flashback and feeling flooded by that, I might ask them to describe things around them. Like, what is something that you see in the room that's blue? What in the room do you see that's purple? To try to bring them back into the room. Also, where are you? Those the basic questions in getting someone back into the present moment. When someone has kind of scaled down into the hypo-aroused state and they're kind of feeling disconnected, maybe it's a dissociative episode or even just feeling numb, we can still use those grounding techniques of engaging the 4 senses, 5 senses if they're in an outpatient setting. But we're doing so for a different purpose, right? We're instead of using grounding as a way of soothing, we're asking someone to engage and connect to their experience around them. I find that tactile sensations tend to be a little more potent for this. So, such as putting feet in the grass, in outpatient setting, even chewing a piece of gum, right? Where the intensity of the flavor as well as the texture of the gum can help with just bringing one out of that numb state. Also, of course, holding an ice cube can be helpful because while it's an intense sensation to hold an ice cube in your hands, I've even had folks feel like they need the intensity of sticking their entire face in a bowl of ice water, but it kind of shocks the system back into the current moment, right? But it's not going to actually physically harm anyone, right? Okay. Then, of course, in conjunction with talking about how do we get back into our window, we want to bring in education and language around DBT, right? And you'll see as we go along how all of these nicely meld together in presenting a cohesive coping strategy for our clients, right? So I'm guessing that most of the folks on the call today have some experience with DBT, so I'll try not to get into the basics too much. But I tend to emphasize at this point in time the first 3 major tenets of DBT. First of which, of course, being that mindfulness, the awareness building of how do I attune to what's going on internally for me, both physically as well as emotionally, as well as what's going on around me in a non-judgmental way, that curiosity of like trying to suspend our interpretations of what's going on around us, or what it means about us if we're feeling a certain way. One of the ways that we can help with that internal awareness is in teaching our clients body scans. What I like about this is it's helps connect physical sensations as maybe the first cue for emotions, because a lot of times our clients are feeling emotions very intensely, but they're not sure how to label it. Even like what's the difference between mixing up sadness and anger, right? And their body may be able to help tell them that. Like for example, I feel disappointment like a pit in my gut. And it's very common for folks to feel anger in their jaw, by clenching their jaw or clenching their fists. Maybe there's tension in their shoulders when they're feeling anxious, right? This kind of can help attune them to what is their body trying to tell them, which is in direct contrast to the eating disorder mindset of my body is against me, right? I've had more success doing body scans in individual sessions. I find that when I do it in a group setting, self-consciousness really rises up, because even though folks have the cognitive awareness that everybody has their eyes closed and they're focused on their own body, it's that same idea of like, well, I feel very aware of my body, so everybody else around me must feel aware of my body. Not to say that it can't work in a group setting, just be aware that it's going to potentially be emotionally more activating in that setting. Those of you that participated in Center for Change's a conference that was wonderful, by the way, in January, learned the pulse exercise. I'm not going to go, we're not going to practice it here today, just in the essence of time, but this is a construct that you can use to help someone with their interoceptive awareness of their body and their sensations. And what you do is you have them find their pulse either on their neck or their wrist, and have them count how many heartbeats they notice in 30 seconds. Then you have them do that exercise again, but without their finger on their neck or their wrist, and just try to perceive, where is my heartbeat, again for 30 seconds. And the disparity between those numbers can loosely be interpreted to indicate how connected they are or able to tune in to their internal body, what's going on in their body, right? And it's just a way to practice for them of like what it feels like to tune inward, right? Then the next DBT construct that we'll focus on is learning about emotion regulation skills. And how I just introduced this idea, I asked them to think of themselves as a human thermometer, if you will. And like, let's pretend like, on a scale of 0 to 10, I'm walking around every day with a baseline anxiety of an 8. Right? That means that I do not have a whole lot of wiggle room before I get out of my window of tolerance, and I'm feeling dysregulated, overwhelmed, I'm not processing, I'm not making sense of anything, and I'm not going to be able to learn, right? So it behooves me to decrease that baseline. If I can even get it to a baseline of 6, even better if I can get it down to a 4. And it doesn't have to be anxiety, but any prominent emotion, then that's going to give me a little bit more wiggle room to expand my window of tolerance. Right? And how we work on emotion regulation, it's consistency over time. So it's not just in the moment, it's something that has to be repeated over and over and over again in order to decrease that baseline. And I'll talk with folks about starting with identifying their vulnerabilities and managing them when they can. And what I mean by vulnerabilities is this, it's anything that makes you potentially more emotionally reactive. The silly example that I use for me is much more so when I was in Atlanta, but traffic, right? Traffic is an irritant to me, but it is so much more irritating if I haven't slept well the night before, right? All things else being equal, traffic's the same, but because of my sleep, it bothers me more. So sleep, or not getting enough sleep, is a vulnerability for me. Right? And when we're attuned to those things, then all right, I can choose to make sure that I'm going to bed earlier so that I have an 8-hour window to sleep. I can make sure that I'm practicing good sleep hygiene, right? And being attentive to those sorts of things. And our vulnerabilities, yes, many of them are physically oriented, like sleep, taking care of ourselves when we're sick, eating balanced diet, exercise, but it may also include things that we may not be able to do anything about, and that is our awareness of them that helps us prepare for situations and feel differently about them. An example of this would be therapy in and of itself, right? That if I am in therapy, I'm probably activating things and talking about and thinking about things that I've pushed aside for quite some time. So I may be more likely to have an emotional reaction to things going on in my life. Just being aware of that and trying to practice kindness towards myself can go a long way. Equally so, of course, medication changes, even though we do that to try to be helpful, that can increase our vulnerability, as well as our relationship history. Right? I can have the same conversation with my mom versus a coworker, and it's going to feel different, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be, but being aware of that can help us prepare for interactions with folks, particularly if we tend to feel more emotionally reactive when we're around them. I also talk with my clients about the importance of consistent self-care. Right, and this is not just that physical self-care, but how are they attending to their social needs? How are they engaging their mind, and kind of caring for themselves in a cognitive capacity? How are they attending to their spiritual needs? Right, all of those are important, and the benefits of which are manifested over time. One of the DBT acronyms that I utilize, of course, with this in vulnerabilities is ABC Please, which I'm guessing those of you on the call know what this means. If you don't, then we can come back to it in the question section. But basically, it's in identifying those different vulnerabilities and how are you going to tackle them, right? So am I getting enough sleep? If I'm not, what am I willing to do about it? What am I not willing to do about it? And therefore, just kind of try to be aware of that piece, right? The next DBT construct that we get into is distress tolerance skills, right? And this is the basic idea behind distress tolerance skills, is that it's getting through a moment that you can't do anything about right then without making the situation worse. Again, I go back to my traffic example, right? I can get road ragey or angry about being stuck in traffic, and that actually makes it a whole lot worse. Not only does my blood pressure go up, but I'm potentially putting myself in danger or someone else in danger, right? So it's to my benefit to find another way to cope with the fact that I cannot make the cars around me move any faster than they already are, right? That might be listening to soothing music. It might be listening to a funny podcast or an enjoyable book on tape, as long as I can still maintain appropriate focus on the road, right? And that's where we're bringing it back circle to that window of tolerance of, all right, how do I get through this in the moment without making the situation work? So again, the soothing and grounding techniques as well as distraction, right? So one acronym that I will teach pretty regularly is the TIP acronym, which stands for the temperature change, which we already talked about, right? The activating of, either the soothing nature of warm temperature or the kind of shock of the cold temperature and bringing someone back into the present moment. Then the I stands for intense activity. Now, this doesn't have to be a physical activity. I mean, especially with someone, if that's part of their eating disorder, is over exercise, but it can be anything that is intensely mentally engaging. And it can be learning a new skill, maybe crocheting or knitting. Those may be familiar with that in an inpatient setting. Also, things like video games that you have to act quickly, maybe Tetris back in the day, or now maybe more so Fruit Ninjas, right? Then the 2 P's in this acronym stand for paced breathing. So kind of that deep, slow breathing, as well as progressive muscle relaxation, which is a type of meditation that, because of the tensing of the muscles and then relaxing, it makes the muscles be more relaxed, in a more relaxed state afterwards. And I want to be clear with my clients when I'm teaching them this TIP acronym, that the 2 P's, they're not going to help with the ruminating, racing thoughts, but they will help quiet down the body, right? Because our body doesn't know the difference of why our sympathetic system is being activated. It doesn't know if we're being chased by a tiger or we're anxious about the topic of conversation that's coming up, right? Both feel unsafe. So if we're doing deep breathing or kind of tensing and relaxing our muscles, it tells our body, oh, okay, I am at least physically safe. So we can calm down that racing heart and those sorts of things. I think that's really important to clarify for clients, because they'll try it and they'll be like, the thoughts are still going, right? So we want to make sure that they understand what benefit will come from each of the different skills that they're implementing. I'll also encourage folks to create a comfort pack. If they're in an inpatient unit, having a family member bring in a comfort pack. And what I mean by that are things that engage those 5 senses, maybe 4 senses if it's in a inpatient setting, because we're not going to have them bringing in gum or other taste-oriented items. But having silly putty, a fidget spinner, a good lotion that has a smell that they really enjoy, essential oils, right? A picture of loved ones or of a beautiful scenery, something small enough that they can keep on their person at all times and pull out when they need it. That again helps with empowerment. And then, distraction, we can utilize a variety of different DBT-oriented acronyms, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over those. Again, if you have questions of what does accept mean or improve the moment, what does that mean? I can address that in the questions or email you about it. All right, of course, we want to have a little bit more conversation about containment skills, right? Not only the importance of it, but helping our clients in practicing this. I found folks really respond to either purchasing or creating in an art therapy group a literal containment box where they can literally write down the intrusive thoughts that are happening, whether it's flashback oriented or a core belief, place it in the box while mentally saying, I will talk about this, I will attend to this, but not right now, right? It's kind of them choosing when, right? But then the act of writing it down helps kind of quell down that immediacy of the emotional part of them that feels like you need to attend to this right now. When we're in a group therapy setting, you know, our more intense levels of care, I find it helpful to, as much as possible, you know, be sandwiching skill groups around process-oriented groups, and of course being mindful of how meal times can impact a process group or vice versa. Right? I know there's only so much time in the day, so at least letting our clients know that we are attentive to this, and that, oh, hey, we just had a process group that was more intense than anticipated. So if you need more support during this meal group, absolutely, let's rally together and figure out what do we need to do to get through this, right? You know, out of like, you know, honoring that unspoken can go a long way in helping our clients feel heard and safe. This is also, I'll talk with folks about safe space meditation, and this might be finding a recording that they connect with online. Also, it can be in creating a script, or, you know, handing them a script that's already made of a safe space meditation that they record in their own voice, right? So again, it kind of feels familiar and safe, and that they can use and play, have it on their phone to use whenever they need to. I also really like having implementing containment rituals at the beginning and end of process-oriented groups. Now, this can be as simple as a check-in and check-out. You know, how are you feeling coming into group, and how are you feeling leaving group? What's your takeaway from this group? What are you needing? Those sorts of things. But it can also be, you know, more symbolic, if you will, like in bringing in colored scarves, and, you know, each member kind of placing a scarf around in the circle of what are they bringing into the group today to bring safety, right? And then some sort of ritual at the end of removing those scarves to signify we are leaving this here in this space, and we can come back to it again at our next group meeting, but until then it's contained here, right? All right, one of the major ways that I will talk with clients in that piece of how do I understand the residual impacts of trauma? How do I separate then from now? Is I introduce this trauma reenactment model. And I loosely kind of feel like this is similar to internal family systems. It's just trying to give folks a construct or a way to make sense of their thoughts and feelings, right? But it's meant to, how it's similar to internal family systems is that it's working on trying to increase awareness and insight onto the function of thoughts, behaviors, and feelings, right? So this is what the trauma reenactment model kind of looks like, is that it's the assumptions that come into play are that there are 3 roles that are played out in any interpersonal related trauma. You know, of course, we talk a lot about, and we're very familiar with the first 2 roles, the victim role and the abuser role, right? But the one that we don't tend to talk about as much, maybe a little bit more so now, as we're, you know, having conversations around, like, you know, victim blaming and, you know, more recent years. But for a long time, we didn't talk a lot about this, and it's that non-protecting bystander, which in my experience can actually be one of the most hurtful elements of this whole triangulated process. So what happens in these interpersonal related traumas is that, you know, of course, there's the person that's being victimized and the abuser, and they have that innate wisdom to know, like, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel okay, right? But the abuser has to have, you know, has to justify their behavior in some way in order to, you know, at least they sit in that cognitive dissonance of realizing that they're doing something that is not okay, right? So in some way they're communicating or justifying what's going on. Maybe even it's just in doing it, and but that lends itself to the person that's being victimized in feeling like they can't trust others, right? Why would somebody do something that feels so innately not okay, right? So, and then at some point, usually folks they reach out or get the message somehow of, you know, reaching out to others to try to make sense of it, right? how could somebody do this, right? And maybe it's in someone feeling like they're not directly talking to someone, but they're just feeling so destroyed inside, and they can't understand why people in their life outside like don't see what's wrong, right? Because they feel so awful. Other people must be able to see that. But it can also be much more direct and painful in someone either minimizing it, asking like, that cringe-worthy expression that I guess we're all familiar with, of like, what were you wearing? Or you're trying to assign any sort of responsibility on the victim for the behavior, or even flat out denying that it happened, right? And that is particularly damaging, because then it sets up that, well, can I trust myself, right? This didn't feel good, but I'm getting the message from others that it either wasn't a thing or wasn't as significant. So can I really trust my judgment? So here we are left with someone that can't trust others, can't trust themselves. And in trying to make sense of the insensible, they end up internalizing these different roles, right? What it looks like for someone to internalize the victim role is this when we're seeing someone feeling helpless, disempowered, defective, right? This is where we might hear someone say like, life just happens to me, right? They're like a leaf in the wind, right? Feeling like very much so that they don't get much of a say-so in life. When someone is in a place of internalizing the abuser role, that's where they tend to be harsh, critical, even punitive. Perfectionistic thinking falls in line here, and rigid thinking or unsympathetic. This is largely, I find, towards one themselves, but can also be projected out onto expectations of others. And the internalized non-protecting bystander is where we find folks minimizing their own needs, right? Definitely, I find that restricting behavior fits into this. It's, the denial of a very fundamental need that humans have to be able to survive, right? And these folks also tend to focus on other people's needs, engaging in people pleasing, trying to keep the peace, right? But not attending to, like, not having themselves in the equation, right? So these are just some other examples of trauma reenactment. Of course, eating disorders are on there. You're welcome to look through the list. I won't spend much time here there, but there's lots of different ways is the message here that someone's past can influence their current behavior. All right, so then what I will do in introducing this trauma reenactment cycle is I will first ask folks to try to identify like the different thoughts and which category they fit in, because most folks, while everyone tends to experience at least some of all three of these different roles, they tend to have a base camp, one that's much more prominent and dominant, and that is helpful because it gives us a starting point and helps me kind of conceptualize and understand what is their framework, right, of how they're making sense of their trauma experience and how it applies to their life right now. And once we get to that, then that gives us a starting point of how do we break the cycle, right? We want to kind of pull them off of that thinking pattern. And how we do that is, so say someone is more stuck in that victim role, feeling like they don't have choice, or hopeless, right? Nothing is ever going to change. I want to help them identifying what their choices are, acknowledging that not making a choice and not doing anything is a choice, right? Really helping identify blind spots. I'd certainly want to point out and help them identify how the present is different from the past, right? As a child, they for sure, had less power, less say so. It's not like they could, say walk out the door and go live somewhere else initiated on their own accord, right? Versus now they can protect themselves and do things differently that a child inherently cannot. Of course, this is also where that empowerment piece comes in, of their ownership over the therapeutic process, that it's not just me spouting off information or making suggestions, right? I want to know what they think and what they feel of what would be best, right? Working on that decision-making process. When someone is kind of stuck more so in that abuser, internalized abuser, I want to try to help them in enacting their compassionate self, right? And this one is particularly difficult for folks, I guess all of these are, but I find buy-in for this one is particularly hard. So a starting point is is asking someone to imagine saying the things that they say to themselves to either a child in general or a child that they know and are close to, because that will help in them at least sitting in the cognitive dissonance of why am I different from others, right? And I'm sure we're all familiar with folks that kind of have that terminal unique idea of like, well, it's not okay to treat others like that, but it is okay for me. But if at least we're reminding them of the difference there, then hopefully that shift will take over time as they're sitting in that cognitive dissonance of why does that actually really make sense? Right. I may also introduce ego states and kind of check in on the time, and I'll not go into that. But again, if you have questions about it, I'm happy to go over of how I use this specifically related to trying to enact the compassionate self. And then the advocate self, for those folks that are engaging in minimizing, of course, I'm going to be asking them at least what are their needs and what would it look like to meet their needs, even if they're not quite willing to do that, helping them with identifying and getting used to even acknowledging that they have needs, right? This is where we may get into exploring anger, either about past or current events, right? And kind of the anger is, I'll talk about anger being a response to injustice, or at least perceived injustice, right? And how do you attend to that? How do you seek justice in everyday life, as well as assertiveness skills, right? That the value in expressing our needs and wants to others isn't just in getting what we need and want, but it's also in validating in ourselves that there is a need to begin with, right? Okay. So I'm going to transition now into some case studies to help kind of illuminate a little bit more what this might look like for someone going through a treatment process. Of course, data has been kind of switched around. These are actual folks that I've worked with, but I've kind of switched details around and combined folks to protect identity. So Peggy is a 42-year-old heterosexual agnostic married Caucasian female presenting to treatment with anorexia, purging subtype but without binges, PTSD, substance abuse, specifically alcohol, major depression, and generalized anxiety. Peggy was verbally, emotionally, physically, and sexually abused by her father her entire childhood. Part of the abuse included withholding food and water. She reports that her mother was also abused by her dad, and that it was her perception that her mom was angry with her for replacing her sexually. And while Peggy's parents live out of state and she doesn't characterize their in-person interactions as currently abusive, they do call unexpectedly, will keep calling until she answers, will visit uninvited, including showing up at her kids' extracurricular events. So the continual process of breaking and not respecting boundaries leads to a lot of emotional unsafety for Peggy. In treatment, she struggles with flashbacks, particularly at meal times, and she states that she can feel her father in the room. And she reports an intense urge to self-harm and punish herself, often, particularly after meal times. But even in just like discussing her, sharing her emotions, because that was part of the control within the family. Like, we don't ever talk about this, or you will be hurt. I will hurt you if you tell anybody about this. So obviously with Peggy, we really had to hone in first on safety. So she did go to a higher level of care to ensure that she was able to just focus on that piece and eliminating some of the other distractions or things going on in life. That also helped her in feeling contained, that, even though it was not for her logical that her dad would come after her, she felt more safe being in a lockdown area to start this process, knowing that he could not get to her, right? We focused, I focused on those basic DBT skills of, how do you manage the flashbacks, and using ice or their soothing and distracting techniques, helping her identify when the flashback or kind of feeling like she was getting outside of her window of tolerance was happening. We gave Peggy a lot of kind of attention and care around honoring where she was and how small her window was. We really had to be honor where she was in the group setting. Like obviously, of course, we needed to encourage her to take risks and in meal settings, right, to make sure that she was getting the nutrition that she needed. But in therapy group sessions, she was allowed to initially be present, do check in and check out, maybe share like I'm, feeling like I'm not sure how to make sense of what I'm feeling or thinking, but really, not the expectation of initially sharing or being emotionally vulnerable in groups, since it was so difficult for her to allow herself to be vulnerable in the meal setting. Of course, that changed over time, but she felt really validated in being able to be met with where she was at. Of course, we taught her and utilized that TIP acronym, created rituals around safety, especially before meals. What were the things that were going to help make that meal experience tolerable for her? And in talking about the trauma reenactment cycle, probably in reading this, it doesn't come as a surprise, but her base camp was the internalized abuser, right? She was incredibly punitive towards herself. So we were working on identifying that compassionate voice. What would she say to her kids, or even in acknowledging, right, that what happened to her wasn't okay, because in her beginning part of her processes, that was still even a leap for her, of feeling like she didn't deserve to be treated that way. Obviously, there's a lot more to her case, but those were some of the beginning pieces of what we focused on in helping Peggy. Moving on to Abby. So Abby was a 24-year-old homosexual single Jewish female presenting to treatment with anorexia restricting subtype and major depression. And while she doesn't meet criteria for PTSD, she reports trauma history including verbal and emotional abuse from her sister, emotional neglect from her parents, chronically overcritical feedback from her mother, and she was the primary caretaker at 17 years old for her mother while her mom died of cancer. Abby reports diet culture messages and pressure from an early age due to family history of obesity. She described her sister and mother as overweight, and Abby recalls an early internal drive to be nothing like her mother and sister, including how they looked physically. So she struggles now with perfectionism. She presents with anxious avoidance attachment with an overt emphasis on avoidance of attachment. She states that she is aware that she is emotionally numb, and while she doesn't fear emotions, she prefers and feels comfortable in feeling disconnected. Abby follows a bland vegan diet, and she reports a sense of pride and moral superiority in being able to restrict her food. The main reason she sought treatment was to help her manage suicidal thoughts, but she has noticed that her eating is negatively impacting her performance in grad school. Okay, so Abby, it may not be hard to recognize in this little synopsis there that her base camp in the trauma reenactment model was the minimizer, right? She didn't even want to acknowledge that she had that fundamental need of food, and in fact garnered a sense of empowerment or power in feeling like I don't need what other people need. Right, so that of course was a major component and piece of her therapy. She initially came in just wanting outpatient work, but luckily through education and kind of like that kind of discussion around poking holes in the arguments of her minimization, she was willing to step up into a higher level of care. Probably she could have gone into even higher than she was willing to, but at least we got enough buy-in to have a little more consistency and working on, acknowledging the severity of her eating disorder, and that it wasn't just the suicidal ideation or wasn't just because she followed a vegan diet. Certainly we worked on helping her out of that hypoaroused state. So in her window of tolerance, it was really hard for her to even really identify when she became overstimulated, because she was generally living in that state of numbness or disengagement. So in trying to pull her out, I engaged in experiential activities with her to try to activate that emotion in the moment. One of the more powerful exercises that she and I engaged in was a Gestalt empty chair exercise, where she was able to access emotion and process through, and get more into the cognitive heady analysis of that experience afterwards, so that she was emotionally regulated afterwards, that she feel like she wasn't walking around raw and open for the rest of the week. We also, of course, on the food side, worked on adding in spices to her vegan diet and exploring, like, she definitely had the moral component to wanting to follow a vegan diet. So we more emphasize, how do you make sure that your food is enjoyable? And she actually responded surprisingly well to, like, all right, if you're going to follow a vegan diet, your portions are actually going to have to be larger. And it was important enough to her that she did that, and that wasn't much of a debate, luckily enough, through her process. Of course, I talked with her a lot about, the impact of her interpersonal wall, of that, the function of it was to keep her safe, that distancing, trying to pretend like she was more avoidant and not wanting a close relationships, but she was able to get to a place of acknowledging she did in fact want to be close to others. It just did not feel safe. So working on how did she define trustworthiness? How did she identify folks that she could slowly take steps toward being vulnerable with? And of course, since she had that piece of feeling powerful through her restriction behavior, we absolutely focused in on other ways that she could empower herself and feel like she had control over her life and her destiny in ways that didn't have anything to do with denying her needs. I'm noticing the time, so at least for right now, I'm going to skip over the third case study and kind of move on. All right, so just in review of what we've talked about, and I want to really emphasize with my clients that containment is not the same thing as silencing. We want to help our clients feel heard, but we want to make sure that we're doing so in a safe way. And how we do that is focusing on the present versus our present impacts versus the past. I also want to make sure that I'm real clear about the difference between distraction and avoidance, right? Because someone may say it's binge watching Netflix, right? Like, that's not necessarily, depending on how you're using it, can be avoidance or can be distraction, right? And of course, again, that emphasis on foundation of safety. And lastly, empowerment, of course, is very important in all therapy, but I think particularly when someone has been mistreated. I find that I emphasize again and again the egalitarian relationship and their choice in this process of, we're not even committing at the beginning that they will ever get to a point of processing memory and actually going into memory work, that is something that they get to decide when they're ready. It's their choice. And with the egalitarian relationship, I emphasize I may know skills or things of how to help with PTSD symptom and eating disorder symptom management, but I'm never going to be able to read their mind. And so letting them, giving them the power in sessions to say, hey, I think I'm getting to the upper limits of my window. Can we pull back a little bit and focus more on the cognitive versus the emotional, right? All right, and then of course, beyond this stage of stabilization, when someone can demonstrate the ability to tolerate urges and not act on them, to be able to keep themselves physically and emotionally safe. Usually I find this is more so like with folks that are restricting, it's they're either close to or at a their weight restored. For folks engaging in binging or purging, that's certainly less frequent, meeting more of, if any, the mild criteria for those presentations. And at that point, we can start dabbling into other types of, or stage 2 oriented trauma therapies, such as EMDR, cognitive processing, somatic experiencing, or trauma-informed CBT. Now, of course, just like anything else, I would recommend you research these models, see what fits best for you, because it is so important that you connect with that model in order for your client to feel confident and comfortable going into this very vulnerable work. For me personally, I feel more connected with cognitive processing and somatic experiencing. And that's something that I feel that I can come in with confidence with my clients and go into that deeper work. Okay. Questions? And then I'll switch also. The next slide is my contact information if we don't get to all the questions.
Hi, EJ.
Hi.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We do have some questions. If you'll send the slides, the screen share back to me, I'll do that, and I'll read you this question in the mean. And if you can't, I think I can from my end.
I think I got it.
Okay, perfect. Yep, there we go. Okay, here's a question. We have several, but we'll try to get to a couple. How do you respond when clients want to share all of the details from their trauma experiences? For example, clients that think they need to recall and share all of the details to heal.
Yes. Okay. So that's where I will talk a little bit about the difference between just getting it out. And I validate where that comes from, that it can feel that, it feels like I have to get this out of me in order to heal. I don't want it to be a part of me. I want it gone. Right. But especially with eating disorder patients, I will equate it, the difference between, actually digesting and processing versus, that word vomit. Right? The same reason of why a purge only is short-term effective, right? Because it's kind of getting things out and kind of emotionally depleting us, but doesn't actually attend to the emotion. Same thing with that word vomit in sharing details about their history. It's going to get it out, but it can also be emotionally activating, not actually help with processing and digesting the information. And then, of course, just coming back to the education of, I want to hear about this, but I want to hear how it impacts you now, because that's a safer option until we can get to the place of that memory work. And so make sure it's clear. We will get there. We just want to make sure that you're safe in getting there.
Great. Thank you. And then we'll do one more, and maybe this isn't a short one, so you might have to abbreviate it, but there were a couple questions asking you to explain the ABC Please concept.
Sure. Yep. I got my little cheat sheet over here. So ABC Please stands for A, accumulate positive events by planning activities you enjoy. B, build mastery by engaging in activities you already excel in or can improve in. So this is like confidence building. Like if we can be confident in one area, then that helps us build confidence in other areas. C, cope ahead of time for distressing situations. So that's kind of that going back to those vulnerabilities. If I know that it's hard to interact with grandma, I'm going to have a plan for when we're going to Christmas dinner of how I'm going to attend to that distressing situation. And then the please is done, helps with those different pieces of things to be aware of that can be common vulnerabilities. And it stands for physical illness, balanced eating, avoid mood altering drugs, balance sleep, and engage your body.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, we're out of time, so we're going to let everybody go. Thanks again, EJ. You did an awesome job. And if you all have more questions, EJ has her email up on the slides, so you're welcome to email her as well. And then just reminders. So when I close out the webinar here in just a minute, an evaluation will pop up. That's an evaluation of the webinar itself. And that's a continuing education requirement for us. So if you would please take just 30 seconds or so to fill out that evaluation, tell us how we did. That would be really helpful for us. Again, it's a completely anonymous, and so it just allows us to get some feedback, and then we compile that data and send it to the continuing education folks who provide those for us. And then about an hour from now, don't panic, I promise it's coming. I get lots of emails after each webinar saying, where is it? I promise it's coming. About an hour or so after the webinar ends, you'll get a separate email from GoToWebinar with a link in it to take the online post test. You must take the online test and pass in order to receive continuing education credit. Once you pass it online, then your certificate will automatically be downloaded to your computer. If you don't see it on your screen, check your downloads file. It should be there. We hope you can join us again next month for our next webinar. And again, thanks to EJ. Everybody take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.